everyone, and welcome once again to the Healthy Living Podcast. I'm your host, Gina Horan. Today we're talking about a revolutionary device that helps stroke patients in the rehabilitation process. And we're here with Terri Stemple of Microtransponder. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did.
Awesome. So Terri, you sent me some statistics that were quite alarming, and I want to read them about strokes. It is the leading cause of disability in the United States, which is quite frightening. Just under 800,000 will suffer a stroke each year. Every 40 seconds, somebody suffers a stroke, and they may not even know it. I mean, sometimes it's in the middle of the night, sometimes it could last a few days, or they start getting symptoms, and so that's also scary. 1 in 6 people will suffer a stroke in their lifetime. And in 1 minute, a stroke can kill almost 2 million brain cells. So that is really alarming stuff. And, you know, basically people think that, you know, they don't know about strokes or anything, you know, a health disaster until it actually happens to them or someone they love. And it's happening quite a bit. So let's start from the beginning. What is a stroke and how is it caused and who does it affect?
Sure. So stroke is a devastating condition. So stroke in simple terms is really just a disruption to the blood flow to the brain. So a stroke can manifest in 2 different ways. It can be ischemic, which means a clot, and that's 87% of the strokes that we see, or it can be hemorrhagic, which means a leaky blood vessel. It can be a leak or a rupture, and that's called a hemorrhagic stroke, and that affects about 13% of the patients who have a stroke. So one of those 2 things happens to disrupt the blood flow to the brain.
So let's talk about, for example, who it can affect, because I know that if you're 55 and over, you do have more of a chance, and then the chance goes exponentially every 10 years. So of course, I'm over 55 and thinking, okay, but I did learn that it doesn't matter the age. People can have strokes pretty much at any age. Can you expand on that for us?
They can. So there's even strokes that happen as early as birth. This can happen at any time frame, and of course there are some risk factors, a lot of them modifiable, but a lot of risk factors that predispose you to be at risk of a stroke. And it is the usual culprits: obesity, diabetes, smoking, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. Those are all modifiable risk factors for stroke, but for at any age put you at a higher risk.
So can you give us an example of maybe something if somebody feels like they have a headache coming on, or like I was mentioning earlier, sometimes strokes happen in the middle of the night. Can you give us examples of what might happen during a stroke or before?
Sure, and that's actually, it's a great question to ask. Last month, May, was the Stroke Awareness Month. And so there is an acronym that you may have seen if you've walked in a doctor's office recently called BFAST. And what that BFAST, B-E-F-A-S-T, stands for is balance problems, starting to feel dizzy. That's the B. The E stands for eyes, if you start to have problems with your vision. The F stands for facial droop, if you start to have some weakness or some facial droop. The A stands for arm, if there's pain or weakness or numbness in the arm. The S stands for speech, if there's slurred speech or difficulty speaking. That can be a warning sign. And then the T in BFAST stands for time to call 911.
So talk about if, let's say I'm alone and I live alone, or I'm alone in my car and I feel symptoms coming on, there's nobody around, what would you suggest that I do?
Call 911.
Call 911 and drive right to the doctor. So now we talked about earlier, you know, some of the signs or some of, you know, obesity or anything else, but what about somebody who's physically fit and has a stroke? Does that ever happen?
So it can happen when there's underlying conditions they don't know about, maybe underlying high blood pressure. There could be some other things going on that we don't see, but typically more healthy people are at a lower risk of having a stroke.
So Terri, after a person has a stroke, what kind of impairments may they suffer? What happens?
So it can be dependent on where the patient's stroke is located, what part of the brain, as to what types of impairments they have, as well as the severity of the stroke. Those impairments could be anything from what's called upper extremity impairments, and that's weakness or paralysis of the hand and the arm. Lower extremity impairments, which is weakness or paralysis of the leg and the foot. They can have speech impairment. They can have issues not just speaking, but understanding things that are being spoken to them. They can have issues with their cognition. There are lots of devastating effects from having a stroke. So immediately after the stroke, the patient might experience many of these things. And over the next 6 months, that patient is going to get some recovery back. It's going to be different amounts of recovery, again, depending on the type of stroke, where the stroke happened, and the type of rehabilitation they do, if any. Once the patient gets to around the 6-month mark, some sooner, some a little bit later, they're going to have what's called the plateau. And what the plateau means is they're no longer making clinically significant improvements in their recovery. And at that point, the patient will be left with these speech impairments, their hand and arm impairments, their leg impairments. And so we may see a stroke patient and we think, oh, well, they just can't move their arm. But when you think about what that means in the life of a stroke patient, that means that they can no longer brush their teeth. It may be that they have to have help taking a shower now, that they can't dress themselves independently, that they have to use a scooter or a walker. But all of these different impairments that are outcomes from having that stroke can really, really be very hard on a patient's quality of life as well as that of their caregiver.
Well, Terri, I think there's something that you want to introduce us to next, and we're going to talk about the Vivistem implant when we come back on the Healthy Living Podcast. Don't go anywhere.
Nobody wants an aging family member who is unable to care for themselves to be home alone. Lake Center Home Care believes the best healing happens when you are most comfortable. The company provides exceptional personal care in the comfort and privacy of your own home. Whether you need skilled nursing, physical therapy, home health aides, or companion services, your loved ones will enjoy peace of mind knowing you're being taken care of and treated with respect and dignity. Lake Center Home Care is locally owned and managed with a team of highly qualified professionals who are passionate about taking care of their neighbors. Call 352-315-0050 or visit golchc.com to learn more about this amazing company.
Welcome back to the Healthy Living Podcast. I'm Gina Horan here with Terri Stemple, and we're talking about the Vivistem implant that helps patients after they've had a stroke. And basically you're saying 60% of patients will have persistent upper extremity weakness in the chronic phase of strokes. That's the first 6 months, correct? What happens after 6 months, and then how can the Vivistem implant help the upper extremities with a patient?
Sure. So as we discussed earlier, at the 6-month mark, that's when research and literature and the FDA consider a patient to be in the chronic phase. As we talked about, it's when that patient is no longer making significant gains in their recovery of their hand and their arm. And as we talked about before, this impacts a patient's quality of life in so many different ways, from all of the self-care activities to all of the hobbies that they can't do anymore, and all of the improvements that they would like to be making in their life. So Vivistem was approved by the FDA at the end of 2021, and this is a device that helps patients recover upper extremity function or hand and arm function.
Okay.
And so what Vivistem is it is a VNS implant, a vagal nerve stimulator, that is called paired therapy. And what that means is the vagus nerve stimulator paired with a 6-week rehab protocol does something which is called inducing neuroplasticity. Now that's a big word that just simply means it helps the brain relearn tasks, because the impairments that the patient is having with their hand and their arm aren't actually issues with the hand and the arm. It's an issue in the brain where the damage happened from the stroke. So the way this implant works is that the implant is stimulated while the patient is doing high repetition, high time on task rehabilitation exercises. And those two things together wake up the attention center of the brain and help it relearn to do that task. We explain it to patients as if we're building a bridge around the damaged part of the brain, forming new neuronal connections to help the brain, the hand, and the arm work together again.
So it's implanted inside. How does is there surgery? How long how long does it last? Is it inpatient, outpatient? How does that work?
Sure. So Vivistem is a procedure. It is an implant that goes right underneath of the clavicle. There's a battery that goes underneath of the clavicle, as well as a lead that goes on the left vagus nerve. It's an outpatient procedure that lasts about 45 to 60 minutes. The patient is under general anesthesia. They go home the same day. They heal through the procedure for 2 weeks, go in and get a post-op check to make sure they're healing correctly, and then they start that 6-week rehab protocol.
So where does the physical therapist come into play here?
Sure.
Obviously, you need a professional and someone who understands the implant itself. How does that work?
So typically, when we talk about rehabilitation, the upper extremity is actually the territory of what's called an occupational therapist. So the majority of the therapists we work with are occupational therapists, although physical therapists can help with this as well. And so that 6-week rehab protocol that starts 2 weeks after the surgery is for 6 weeks. It's 3 times a week for 90-minute sessions. That's what's called high intensity rehab. It's a lot of rehab, it's a lot of repetitions, it's evidence-based medicine that if you do high repetitions while you're using this vagus nerve stimulator, you'll be able to start to reform those neuronal connections.
So in the 3 years this has been out, have you seen much progress? Talk about some success stories and who's benefiting from this.
Sure. So in our clinical trial, we had 108 patients, and those patients had an outcome measure that showed 2 to 3 times the improvement of what they got from rehab alone. So the Vivistem was helping them get motor recovery. In the 3 years since this has been out, we've seen some amazing recoveries. When the patients start their 6-week rehab protocol with their therapist, they start by mapping out what their specific goals are. And the rehabilitation tasks that the therapist sets up for them are specific to the things the patient wants to accomplish. Now, as you can imagine, different patients want different things, and they have different impairments. So we may have a patient that wants to be able to mow his lawn again. We may have a patient that wants to be able to write their name again. We've had a patient that wanted to be able to cast his fishing rod again. So everybody has different goals, so their therapy tasks are going to look differently. So a patient that we just worked with recently, when he started Vivistem, could not pick up a pen and could not write his name any longer. And at the end of his 6 weeks of rehab, he wrote me a birthday card and signed it, "Happy birthday, patient's name."
Oh, that's so sweet.
It's wonderful. We've had patients who have been able to start to shower completely independently again because now they can use that affected arm and hand to reach over to the other side. We've had patients that could not cut their own food after their stroke and now could go out in public and have dinner and cut their own food for their meal.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Now, Terri, talk to me about in the couple years that you've been working with Vivistem, how have you personally felt, just knowing that you're helping people and like you just said, someone wrote you a birthday card, that must have felt great.
It did. I feel fortunate and blessed to get to be a part of this and help people through their recovery journey. I'm sort of with them at most steps through the Vivistem process, which starts with an early education call where we just talk about the therapy and about the procedure, to attending their procedure to test their equipment, to going to their rehab appointments with them. And they almost invite me into their family during this process. So I feel like I'm just really, really blessed to get to be a part of this. But seeing these people achieve their goals and get the recovery that they're looking for, it's just very, very rewarding.
So does the implant come out at any point?
So that's a great question. So we always get asked, and even the patient wants to know, what happens at the end of 6 weeks? So that's really just a point in time that we had for the FDA. Right, so that we had somewhere to measure outcomes. But what we found was our patients from our clinical trial and even our patients that have been implanted since, the ones that continue to work with their Vivistem continue to improve. So as we talked about before, the way this device is working is it's helping build new connections in the brain. So those connections are the patient's forever, whether they use that device or not. The brain relearned how to use the hand and the arm. So at the end of 6 weeks, if the patient is satisfied, they can absolutely quit using the device and they will still have all of those gains. They could even have the device out if they wanted to. But most of our patients are so excited and really just starting to get started in the things that they could do, that they want to continue to use the device. And the one thing that I had forgotten to mention earlier, when we talk about this rehabilitation, it's a 6-week process, 3 times a week, 90 minutes a session with a therapist. But the patient also gets a magnet that they can take with them when they're at home on their days off, on the weekends. They can swipe their device at home and get 30 minutes of therapy. And they can actually do that up to 8 times a day. So they can get 4 additional hours of therapy on top of what they're doing in the clinic to kind of boost that improvement, to speed that improvement along. And so many of our patients, even after their 6 weeks, will continue swiping their magnet at home and doing activities and exercises that help them continue to improve.
So Terri, tell me, is everybody eligible for the Vivistem implant? How does that work?
Okay, that's a great question. So the patient has to have had an ischemic stroke, which is the clot kind of stroke. The patient has to be healthy enough to have surgery. The patient has to have persistent upper extremity impairment, like we talked about, in the hand and the arm. The patient has to be in the chronic phase, which we talked about is at least 6 months post-stroke. There is no upper limit to how long time since stroke for the patient. Even in our clinical trials, we had patients all the way up through 10 years post-stroke, but at least 6 months post-stroke. The patient can't have had a bilateral or left vagotomy because this is a vagal nerve stimulator.
Okay, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to tell me what that
Sure.
is for those of us out there who don't read Grey's Anatomy every day.
So that literally just means that they haven't had their vagus nerve removed.
Okay.
That's an excellent question.
Anything
I
else?
should clarify
No,
that.
it's all right. It's okay. That's we're here to learn. So, anything else on
And
this?
so they also need to fall into a category called moderate to severe upper extremity impairment, and that is determined by an occupational therapist at an occupational therapy evaluation. And so then that's patients who are eligible. There's also what we talk about, which is candidacy, and that's where there comes into play a couple of other factors that might impact a patient's eligibility. And that includes things like spasticity. A lot of stroke patients have spasticity, and it can't be so severe that it would impede them doing that 6-week rehab protocol. Some stroke patients have sensory deficits. Those sensory deficits cannot be so severe that it would impede them doing a rehab protocol. The patient also needs to have a little bit of movement in their thumb and their finger. Now, these are all very, very specific criteria, and these are all determined at the occupational therapy evaluation.
So not determined by a physician or a primary care physician, it is the occupational therapist.
And the reason that the occupational therapy evaluation is required, and that is required before the surgical consult where we find out if we're medically able to have surgery. Okay. But the reason for that is because that rehab protocol is very intense, and they're going to be able to tell by looking at that patient's function and impairment in the evaluation if they would be able to participate in those 6 weeks. Without those 6 weeks of rehab, that very intense protocol, we won't get the outcomes we're looking for.
Okay, and finally, inquiring minds always want to know, does insurance cover this, and can everybody qualify?
That's a great question. So this is a new therapy. As I mentioned before, we were FDA approved at the end of 2021. So Medicare fee-for-service, Medicare red, white, and blue, traditional Medicare, however we want to call Medicare, they will absolutely pay for this.
Oh, that's great, especially because of the age group that
Yes.
this affects.
As far as commercial patients, which is our United Healthcares, our Aetnas, our Blue Cross Blue Shields, as well as Medicare Advantage, which are Aetna Medicare Advantage, United Healthcare Medicare Advantage, all of those patients would need to go through what's called prior authorization. So with any new technology that's out there, this is the procedure that you have to go through, which is basically we submit all of the information to the insurance company. They look at the history, they look at the qualifications, and they approve them on a case-by-case basis. So all commercial, all Medicare Advantage patients will go through that prior auth process. 88% of the time, these patients are going to get approved. Because it is a new therapy, it's just an extra step that we have to take. It's something that the surgeon's office, as well as my company, helps the patient through that process.
Oh, good. So there is help going through
There
the
is
minefield of paperwork.
Yes,
that has
100%. We have a dedicated team that does nothing but help through the prior authorization process.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's the best part.
Yes, and so there is a process to get there. Straight Medicare, traditional Medicare can go straight through to get their implant.
Well, Terri, it's been amazing talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I learned so much. Is there anywhere that our listeners, viewers, readers can find out more about Vivistem?
Yes, we would encourage you to go to www.vivistem.com, and that's VIVISTIM.com. You can fill out a contact card there after looking around the website, and one of our nurse navigators will actually reach out to you and answer any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
There it is, another edition of the Healthy Living Podcast. I'm Gina Horan. We'll see you next time.